Hello there, welcome to the second Dev Conversations from Swift Toolkit, the first video episode. It's a series where we talk with developers in the Swift on server and tooling space. Today we have Andrew Barba, who nowadays works at Vercel, and he's been doing pretty interesting stuff. His latest work is SwiftCloud, which we covered in an article 2 weeks ago. Thanks for joining us today, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to talk about Swift.
Sure. Um, just to start, tell me a little bit about your background in programming, how to start coding.
Yeah, so I started really as an iOS developer. The first place I ever worked was WhatsApp, and I had a chance to go there and build an iOS app like really early on, right? Like back in the iOS 5 or yeah, iOS 5 days, I believe, where like I think automatic reference counting had just come out. So a lot of Objective-C at the time, and I was just all self-taught on the iOS side. So ended up going to school, for computer science, but
Nice.
very early in my career, I spent a lot of time just self-teaching myself Objective-C and then obviously Swift.
Good old days. And then you moved to Tablelist, where I assume you did a lot of iOS development. What were the main things you did there? What were the most interesting challenges?
Yeah, exactly. So Tableless was what started as a consumer platform for customers to book reservations at high-end nightclubs. So you can really think of it as like an open table, but for nightlife. And we built that company when I was still in college. And so I ended up working there for some 5, 6 years, even after college. But really, my role there was to lead the native iOS development, which originally was just the consumer iOS app, but then very shortly after we realized that in order to have like a really good system for customers and the nightclubs, we basically had to build the management software for the clubs as well. So I was also responsible for building the iPad app, which is what got basically the most usage inside of the nightclubs.
Nice.
So yeah, it was a really fun place to be. I'd say some of the most interesting things and some of the things that I was really proud of was um, being offline first from the jump. So, we were using heavy core data, from the start, and then ultimately switched over to Realm. Once we migrated the app over to Swift, Realm just made a lot more sense. And at the
Yeah.
time, like Realm was
They did offline
just like a
stuff and
groundbreaking
syncing.
SDK for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and back then, like we didn't even use it for all the syncing and whatnot. It's just that their local data store was just so much better
Yeah.
than core data at the
Core
time.
data. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you did backend stuff there?
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, just being at a startup, like really, it just necessitated me to move from iOS over to a lot of backend, and this was also around when Node 0.10 was released, and so we ended up building most of the table as backend on Node and Heroku at
Nice.
the time. And so I started to spend just a lot of time with like backend server technologies, scaling servers, using things like queues and different database technologies and things like that. And so, yeah, I mean, my career kind of like at that point started to shift a little bit away from, a ton of iOS development at the time. And then I started moving into much more like back-end architecture
You
type of
left.
work.
You left the bubble.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And then you moved on to Barstool Sports. That's where you started doing um, Swift on the server, more or less.
Exactly.
And
Yeah. So yeah, joined Barstool Sports in 2017, where the first thing I did was actually just got their iOS app at the time and rebuild that natively from scratch. But similar to Tableless, very shortly after, I had to move to the back end and start to rebuild, basically their entire backend system, which was all in AWS. And we chose to use Lambda very early on. It ended up being a phenomenal call, but it was certainly a bit of a rocky road to get it to where it is today. But yeah, we
yeah,
made the choice to be 100% serverless, and that directed a lot about how we thought about Swift on the back end as well, just because serverless technology, I think it did such a good job like abstracting away like all these super challenging concepts when it comes to
Yeah,
backend architecture.
but from a product perspective, was it for was dynamic ad insertions or something different?
Yeah, so the first Swift service we actually built at Barstool was a streaming media service, and it did dynamic ad insertion. And so this was built on Fastly's cloud and their edge compute platform, which is a WebAssembly based runtime that gets executed at the edge. And they did not have a great JavaScript SDK at all. They really only had a Rust SDK. And I wanted to see if I could write it in Swift. And so, yeah, we built this service that did all of our podcast server-side ad insertion in Swift,
Oh,
and
wow.
we compiled the Swift WebAssembly and deployed it to Fastly's cloud.
Amazing. And that's how many years ago?
This was in, let's see, this went live in 2022, I believe. Yeah, yeah, 2022.
Oh man, it's not that long ago. So it's not where we are today, but still not in the early days as well.
Exactly. Yeah, m most of Barstool was Node on Lambda, and then this was like the first time where we got to try and use Swift, and it was for basically one of our most mission critical services, which is
Amazing,
our podcast platform. So yeah, and it's still running today, and it's been an amazing service for us.
amazing. How was the exception from people who are not into Swift so much? Was there any resistance from their side?
Yeah, so the language itself had little to no resistance. The tooling is what really had the most resistance from the other engineers, right? When you're so used to using
Yeah,
things like, npm install and looking for packages on npm and just, using VS
yeah, the whole
Code and how well it
ecosystem.
understands TypeScript and things like that. So, telling somebody to go download a 10 gigabyte Xcode IDE was a bit of a shock
Yeah,
to go try and write Swift. Um, and then you throw on the fact that we're actually compiling to WebAssembly, and so it was very bleeding edge technology. Um, and so the tooling was probably the most frustrating, aspect.
yeah, I understand that. And from there, you started working a side project, right? On the first version of SwiftCloud.
Exactly, yeah. So basically, I took that Fastly compute runtime, which we were using, and it was just it was just so easy to deploy a Swift app to Fastly once you had all the correct tools in place. And so the idea for me was, well, how do we make it easy for everyone to deploy Swift on the server? And especially like when you look at the language, it's having like async await now, like even like throw like typed errors in Swift 6, like the language is so good for server side development. But the problem is it was just way too hard to go figure out how to actually
To
deploy a Swift app to
deploy.
the server.
Yeah,
And so that was the idea behind Swift Cloud is let's go build the easiest platform to deploy Swift on the server. Um, and yeah, that was the first version where I wanted to do it on top of Fastly because it was fully serverless. It was streaming based, so really high performant, and really easy to do custom domains and things like that. So there was a lot of nice things that Fastly provided out of the box that made it a good platform to build Swift Cloud. But ultimately, I think the first version suffered from just being too bleeding edge on the WebAssembly front.
I see. And from there, that that work on SwiftCloud made you got your job at Vercel, right? Just
Yeah,
for those
yeah,
who don't know
exactly.
what Vercel is.
Yeah, so Vercel is the leading front end cloud platform. So it is the place where web developers go to deploy and host their websites. Everything from simple static sites to very dynamic serverless sites. Um, and Swift Cloud had a lot of principles and was getting a lot of
The
inspiration from
same,
the things that
yeah.
Vercel was building.
The developer
Um,
experience.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so I had a chance to demo the Swift Cloud platform to Guillermo, the CEO of Vercel. And it was very shortly after that, he was like, "Hey, like you should just,
Come here, go over.
come build CDNs at Vercel."
Yeah, and I assume there you experienced more other languages.
Exactly. So I have not had a chance to introduce Swift to Vercel yet. I'm hoping one day, but yeah, most of my time at Vercel is spent writing Golang and Lua.
And I assume also a lot of JavaScript, the ecosystem and
Exactly. Yeah. I would say every engineer at Vercel is fairly fluent in TypeScript.
Yeah. Um, what's your favorite part about other languages that you don't get in Swift?
That's a great question. I would say so. Golang is probably the most interesting language that I write day to day compared to Swift. And my thing with Golang is it just feels so lightweight, right? And sometimes Swift can just feel so heavy. And
Heavy.
that's for a lot
What
of
type
reasons. A lot of,
system? I mean,
exactly. Yeah. And not even the type system. Honestly, parts of it is just, using Xcode and like, it feels like you need all this horsepower to write Swift. And it feels like you need 0 horsepower to write Golang. And so I would love for Swift to just start to feel more lightweight, in build times, in the, the way it interacts with IDEs, like the language server protocol, like things like that. Like I think it's starting to move into that direction.
yeah,
And now today, actually, 100% of the Swift I write is inside VS Code. I haven't
VS
used
Code.
Xcode in quite some time. So I feel like we're starting to move in that direction.
Yeah, like
Um,
to leave the Apple bubble.
Exactly. Yeah, and I just love how, Go, like it has built-in formatters, it has built-in benchmarking built in. So it has all these features that you're starting to see Swift adopt. Like, I use the Swift format plugin in VS Code, which is now working great. The official Swift plugin for VS Code has built-in testing. So we're starting to catch up to some of these other languages
Other
that are
languages.
just more yeah, just have more experience on the server.
Flexibility. Yeah, nice. And and you released around 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, SwiftCloud, the new version of SwiftCloud. Uh, do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Would love to. Yeah. So when I first launched the first version of Swift Cloud, what I found was I knew too much. I knew too much of the behind the scenes that I couldn't project to end users of Swift Cloud. And the most obvious example of this is people would come to the platform and they would write in and they would say, hey, how do I get my Vapor app, running on Swift Cloud? Or how do I get my Hummingbird app? Or why, how can I use Swift Neo or async HTTP client? And all these things were just heavily limited because of the fact that there's no there's no support for those things inside of WebAssembly. And so the types of Swift apps that you could build on Swift Cloud were way too limiting, and they were taking you too far outside of the Swift server ecosystem that Apple was trying to build. And so I wanted to take a completely new approach and develop an SDK that was framework agnostic, the full Swift runtime, and cloud provider agnostic, and of course being fully open source. So it's a complete shift in direction from what the initial
Initial
platform was,
idea.
but I think it's
Yeah,
even more in line with the vision I wanted with the original platform. And now it's giving people the tools to deploy backend Swift applications to any cloud that they want.
everywhere.
Um, yeah, and naturally, of course, we're starting with AWS just because they have the most primitives, and Apple's doing a lot of work. Specifically around compiling to Linux. They publish Amazon Linux 2 um, Docker images. They publish the AWS Lambda runtime. So Apple's doing a
Right.
lot of work to make Swift run well on AWS primitives. And so, yeah, I felt like releasing the new version of the
That's
Swift Cloud SDK
the
for
best
AWS
fit.
first was the best fit.
Yeah,
Exactly.
nice. And you know already what are the next steps for it?
Yeah, get some early feedback is what I would love. So, I've had this vision in my head for a long time. It's taken,
Hmm.
I'm taking inspiration from a lot of other great um,
Tools.
software as code solutions, or infrastructure as code solutions. So things like Pulumi and SST, CDK and Terraform. So I'm trying to take the best of all of those other IAC providers, but build
And
something that's
unify
Swift
them.
native. And so now it's just a matter of, let's getting feedback, help shape, what the future, API looks like inside of SwiftCloud. And yeah, there's so many different areas of improvement. And it really just comes down to, letting people get their hands on it and start to use it. And then of course, obviously adding new providers. Fastly and Vercel will probably be the next two that I add because I already have a lot of experience deploying to those two platforms today. But I'd love
Sweet.
to see someone go support Fly or Render or GCP. Like
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
primitives are there for them to do that.
Anyone can come in and contribute. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
What I personally really like is that you're not required to know Docker or learn how to write a Docker file or a complicated packaging script or uploading. Takes care of all the steps, and it even abstracts the concept of resources, policies, roles. And we are only talking about AWS, and each provider has its own intricacies and whatnot.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, yeah, most people, if you were to start a new Vapor app today, it has some, 100-line Docker file in it, which most people probably have no
Yeah,
idea what's going on in that file. Um, and I wanted to take a very different approach where you're not building inside of Docker, you're building natively, and in Swift 6, we'll be able to use the
cross
native
engine.
SDK cross compilation, which we'll move to basically, as soon as that's released. And so we won't even need Docker at all, which is amazing. And the idea is, really all the Docker file is just the way I have it work in SwiftCloud today. The Docker file is a simple copy of the Swift executable, and that's it. And
Mhm.
this is just because that's how the cloud providers expect for you to deploy. They usually manage some type of container registry behind the scenes. At least that's what AWS
Yeah.
does and Google. And so, the Docker file is just the super thin, couple line code that's inside the SDK, and you never even see it.
What I find fascinating about Swift on servers that it lowers the barrier so much for people who have an iOS background development. And that's exactly what SwiftCloud solves, right? It lowers the barrier for even for deploying. So I think this is beautiful and can empower people to do so much great stuff.
Yeah, I love to hear that. I mean, my dream is really to mimic what Next.js did for JavaScript, where you could build a website and drop in a folder called API, and now your website can talk to your API, and it's all deployed. I imagine you create a new target in Xcode right alongside your iOS target. You define your infrastructure and your backend services, and you deploy them, and boom, and now your
Yeah,
iOS app is has a super scalable
everything it
API to
needs.
talk to, and you own all of it.
Very cool. All right, Andrew. Um, Thank you so much for first of all of your work for time with us today. If people want to find you or follow your work, where they can find you.
Yeah, Twitter or X is probably the best place, x.com/Andrew_Barba. And of course, Swift.cloud, you'll start to see the site transforming over the next, weeks and months to be a lot more documentation and tutorial focused. So
And
please reach out there. And
oriented to the new model, if you can call it like that.
exactly. Yep, exactly.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Bye
much. It was
bye.
great talking to you.